Afternoon, welcome to the second presentation of the Transport Seminar Series. This is a series of presentations organized by the School of Planning and Geography in collaboration with the Welsh Government and Helen Market. Today is our great pleasure to introduce Andrew Jones. Andrew is the project director at Mott MacDonald. He has over 30 years of experience in transport planning and civil engineering, most of it leading and managing multidisciplinary teams in many parts of the world. He has undertaken major master planning, public transport, multimodal modeling and interchange design studies on behalf of transport operators, developers and local authorities, government bodies and international funding organizations. This has required extensive collaboration, negotiation and presentation to clients, transport operators, planning authorities and other stakeholders. Many of the projects have involved intermediate mode technologies, light rail, busways and guided transit, with route assessment, demand modeling, economic viability and interchange design. Today, Andrew will be talking about the project that he's just finished, about Gibraltar and sustainable traffic, transport and parking plan. So, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm going to take you through a project that we've been doing over the last couple of years now in Gibraltar. The reason I picked this, it's not the only project I've worked on over the last couple of years, some people will be pleased to know, but it is a very good example in a very small scale of how you just can't look at transport in isolation, how it's so tied to the economy and land uses, and therefore the problems that they have there are not unique to Gibraltar, but there are some very unique features, and the solutions are not all about transport. You have to take into account all the other social, land use and economy aspects. So what I was going to do over the next hour was to run through some of the background to how we did the study, and I was going to finish off with a presentation that we gave to Gibraltar Government just before Christmas. As it's quite a small group, I'm quite happy to take questions as we go along, okay, rather than you wait till the end. So if there's anything that you query or you want to add, then please contribute, okay? I think I've already asked you if anybody's been to Gibraltar, and no one has, nobody's from Gibraltar. So I'll give you a bit of background to it. It's about 6 square kilometres. It's got a population of about 30,000 people. And normally that's a very small town in this country, or most parts of the world. We wouldn't normally spend a lot of time developing transport plans, certainly not an expensive transport model for it. There are a number of reasons to do that. One, they're very rich, so we, as consultants, we have to take their money. But they have got some special parts of their situation there that drives, that sort of moves us to doing an in-depth modelling exercise and coming up with a range of different solutions. So, I don't know, do people know very much about Gibraltar? You know where it is on the southern tip of Spain. Presumably a lot of people have heard about some of the continuing issues between Spain and Gibraltar and movements. I'll come on to some of those. Do you know how Gibraltar makes its money?
Tourism.
Tourism's one of them, yeah. They get maybe 2 or 3 cruise ships a day throughout much of the year coming in there. Anybody else? Does anybody bet? Does anybody think that Italy are going to win the Rugby World Championship? Where would you put your money? Okay. Well, if you go online or you phone up, it'll be in Gibraltar. That will be your connection. So most of, not just the UK, but European offshore betting is done here. 88, 888, all those ones that sponsor snooker players are here. And they're here because it's 8%, 10% now business tax, so very, very low, so that's why they're set up there. That's a 24/7 business, so we've got offices going throughout the day, handling all these loans. Finance, banking, again because of the low taxation. So in terms of per capita head, I think it ranks as second in the world in terms of the number of Big Four accountancy practices that are based on the population. I think it's fifth in the world in terms of international banking. It's got GDP that's been growing at 6+% for the last 20 years. So really strong economy, and it's all driven by the fact that it's a low tax. There are some issues about how that's applied, particularly within the EU. It's within the EU, and it comes under British law, particularly business law. And it's interesting that has been a big driver there, and for businesses to go and set up. Okay, and so comparator, a lot of work I also do is in Dubai. Dubai has similarly adopted British common law practice for businesses. In fact, Abu Dhabi has just done the same, because it's seen as a safe haven to go and do business, to invest your money, to be sure that you've got a balanced legal process if you do come into contractual disputes like that. So, and again, we'll come on to the wider economy. That's one of the things that's really driven. You talk about tourism, we'll see there are a few interesting things that are there to look at. But it's really, not many people come by coach, they do from roundabout, particularly the Brits who live on the south coast of Spain. They come in to go shopping at Morrison's and other things there. But the cruise ships come in each day, and they come there for a number of reasons. There are some historic things, sights to see, but the two real drivers for them. They come in and they pay low rate to be refuelled, bunkering as they call it. So that's why all the cruise ships going around the Mediterranean try and call in that. The other reason is that because it's a tax-free place, they can then charge low tax on alcohol for the rest of their trip around there. So all these sorts of things that you wouldn't have any understanding of, but are really driving why 3 ships will come in, and for 6 hours during the day, you'll get another 6,000 people will come off those 3 ships, and you'll get 8,000 people coming over the border to come and do business in the banking and the sector. So you get half the population increases by 50% during the day. So they're all big influx coming in, and then they go out again at night. Very, very, very odd. And why has it happened? Well, does anybody know what the Treaty of Utrecht is, when it was signed? Yeah? It's a bit of a history question. Right, well, it was 1713, okay, that it was signed. It was at the end of the European War of Spanish Succession, and in this country we've never heard of it. Most places in Europe we've never heard of it. In Gibraltar it's like the Bible, they know it back to front. And basically what it did, you had French against Britain against Austria, Hungary, you had what was called Spanish Netherlands in that time, and they basically stopped fighting, and they divided not only the whole of Europe. Basically, the map of Europe was largely set at those times, setting up the boundaries for Italy, Spain. The Netherlands wouldn't exist. So when people in Spain say, well, we want to go back to what it was, then it would mean effectively giving not only Gibraltar back to Spain, but Holland back to Spain as well. And it also set the boundaries for Canada in terms of French and British interests, and between Spain and Portugal in South America, so the definition of Brazil and the rest of the places. So it's something we don't take into much account. The big thing here, for anyone who's got good eyes, it says down here, Gibraltar to England. Okay, so that was part of it. And it's because, as you can see, it was strategically important, and it became, after this, became even more strategically important when we built the Suez Canal as a route through to India and beyond. So it's a dirty great big rock sticking out towards North Africa. It doesn't even have to be good weather day, and you can see North Africa. So it has been fought over ever since that time, through the Peninsular Wars, through into the Second World War, where it was a major base, and then into the Cold War. And much of it is all buried underground within the rock. It's very interesting to go in there, and it still is a major communications centre for. But the Cold War in particular. There are not only hospitals built in there and the water supply, but nuclear-proof power stations and all these sorts of things that are there. And in this day and age, there's a big question about whether it's still strategically important to Britain. But it's certainly important to the 30,000 people who live there. And there's been lots of debate over the years about whether it should go back to Spain with various referendum. The big one was in 1969, and they said, I think it was 98% said no. So that was quite clear, and Franco, who was in power in Spain at the time, said, right, we're going to close the boundary. And so there was the normal thing you see around the world, splitting of families on one side. They couldn't actually get to actually travel between Gibraltar and Spain. You had to come over to Morocco and then go back on a ferry or something like that. And it was closed for 15 years. And during that time, people there had nothing to do, so they just bought cars and drove around and around. And it's only 6 kilometres long. With, there's more miles of tunnel there than there are miles of road. So, and unfortunately, because they were very well off, that drove car ownership up and up, and also this love affair with the car was driven up as a consequence of that. Basically, the boundaries came down, the borders opened up in mid-80s, not because of any thawing of relations, but because Spain wanted to join the European Union, and the consequence of that was that they had to abide by open border. But they still can be very difficult about it. I'm not trying to be biased here. There are a number of issues and cross-border. There's immigration issues, and more particularly because there's low taxation and no VAT, alcohol and cigarettes are about 10% of the price in Gibraltar as they are across the boundary, and fuel is also much cheaper. So what you actually find, and this is a map of Gibraltar as it sits now. This is Spain up here. You've got a runway in between here, which is an interesting. You get some interesting landings and takeoff some of the time. It's one of the most treacherous airports to land at in the world. Although they're very proud to say they've never had an accident. I shouldn't be saying that today, I suppose. But a number of times, because this is a great big rock in here, and this is low down, you get lots of crosswinds and you get diverted to Malaga. And it's actually still an RAF runway, which they run commercial flights on, mainly from the UK, but in the summer season from around the rest of Europe as well. But what happens, there's one of the biggest petrol stations you've ever seen, just in here, and then you get a queue of people who come in here, fill up the tank, load up with cigarettes and booze, and then turn around the roundabout there. Huge number of U-turns on the roundabout, and they go back into Spain. That's what you do on a Friday night or a weekend. So, you look at what's happening with this roundabout, and it's all driven by that. And then you get some, having filled up with the tank, you still get some that break down here. And generally it's because they've run out of fuel, because the tank is actually a false tank full of cigarettes. And that's what the Spanish border guards are looking for. So they've only got enough to get a teaspoonful of fuel in to get back over, and they go round and round in circles. So that really governs the rules and regulations at the border here, with this influx of maybe 8,000 people each morning to come and work. And then what you've got, the rest of Gibraltar, you've got this dirty great big rock here, as I say, with lots of tunnels. And then in here, from the 60s onwards, this area was reclaimed land. So a lot of, and that continues to go on now, and that's what, again, the Spanish authorities get very concerned about. There's a Russian development, again, Russian money coming in. They feel it's a safe place. They want to get involved in in moving diamonds and other things there, and they want to build a great big bit out here, and with a development complex and holiday homes and things like that. And again, that is a big issue about how access works and how people move around. So in this area here, you've got lots of flat land, a number of better roads. Up here, these roads are very narrow, maybe only a few metres wide. There's hardly any parking on some of these areas, and it's very steep. So it's not conducive to walking or cycling up here, sorry, up here, but it is down here. So all those aspects that we've looked at. Okay. Any questions about Gibraltar before I go on? So it's an interesting place to go. Lots of history to it. You're going back to when after the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson, when he was killed there, his body was brought here. First of all, stuck him in a barrel of brandy, and then brought him back to the UK. We're burying in Westminster Abbey, and say within here, there's lots of areas, particularly in the Second World War, with Eisenhower being based here. Very interesting to the Americans. They have lots of Disney cruise ships coming in, and they're very keen to open all this up and go through the tunnels. So in the tunnels, you've got miles and miles like this. Some of the tunnels have better alignments than the roads do. Some of them are used for parking, but all sorts of things, as the sort of where the magazines were and power stations. And going back in time, there are caves in here that go back to the earliest, basically the view is that the Neanderthals, this was their last retreat in Europe, and the first Neanderthal skull was found just down the end there. Unfortunately, they didn't realise it was that old at the moment. It's in the British Museum now, until they found the next one in the Neander Valley in Germany. That's why it's called Neanderthal man rather than Gibraltar man. So, that's a bit of background. Go through the study process. So as Mott MacDonald, we were, I'll give the normal thing, give a bid for looking at all our problems and coming up with some solutions. Okay, and about a year in theory to study it. And this was the process that we were suggesting. First of all, what do you want at Gibraltar? What's your future going to be? And what are the key problems that you've got at the moment, and what do you want to see, not just in the next few years, but 20, 30 years moving forward with population changes. That would then lead us to what sort of information required, and I'll spend a bit of time on the surveys. And then one of the key bits is, it's all very well doing lots of these things academically, but unless you're on the ground and understand how people feel about these things and what their concerns are, you can't understand whether what you're proposing is going to work. And in a place like Gibraltar, of only 30,000 people, basically all your politicians, although the First Minister reports to the Queen, he doesn't see it very often. He's actually on a day-to-day basis looking at the people who live next door to him, and if one of them says, I need a disabled pass to park my car outside, he's likely to do it, not only because they vote for him, but because they've been friends since school days, and it's very difficult to break that away. So in Wales, there are a number of issues here with the tiers of government, particularly when you're looking at transport and land use planning. We have the Welsh Government at the top end doing a lot of the policy work, and we've got the city councils doing the day-to-day bits and pieces, parking and others. What we don't have is a tier of planning and land use together. Whereas in England, we do tend to have that in terms of regional bodies. It's even more extreme here. So you've got central government not only setting policy, but actually sorting out the day-to-day parking issues. And it doesn't work, basically. It's not a good model. You need to separate those out. You need different representatives to look at the pros and cons of those. So those are the first bits, what we call stage definition. Next bit is the data collection. We'll go through a bit of this. And then we call it a lens assessment. A number of issues. This is one of the ones. Parking for bikes. We have loads of bikes in Gibraltar, people come across. They don't have any standards. You see everywhere today, any new development puts sites, Sheffield Sands, they don't in Gibraltar, so everybody padlocks them to a tree. It's just, it's a super. Another thing on from that, in this country now with our planning rules, any new development, you've got to have showers and changing facilities to encourage people to walk in or cycle and things like that. They haven't done that in Gibraltar, so you get in a climate that's very conducive to that, as long as you can change. They don't have that. It's a fairly simple thing. It's not about transport traffic. Sorry. Yeah.
So they haven't developed yet bicycle lanes as they should be?
Very little. Very little. We'll come on to those. They do have what they call Gibby bike, which is similar to the Boris bike. They had that operating, but it failed, basically, and it's, although you still see the things around, there wasn't big enough take-up of it. So they've tried to, I should say that in many of these situations, it's like working in the Middle East. There's a sort of money no object to some of these things. They can afford to do lots of things, but as we often talk about, you need a carrot and stick to make people change, and they're very happy to make really juicy carrots. So locals don't have to pay bus fares, for example, but they're not prepared to do the sticks of putting in parking controls, charging people for parking, which you know you need. So that's and you can see why, because those people are voting for them. But it is that difference, and it's not. You can't just make it nicer and nicer to do it. So we talked about all sorts of encouragement for school kids to buy bikes, for example, but we don't do it.
And land use is also a problem for these?
Yeah, land is very scarce and so very expensive to develop.
Yeah.
And so you've got two ends, because it was very much a military base, so you've got a lot of housing estates which were basically built in the 60s in many of the same ways, were basically the same designers. So fairly poor quality and needed refurbishment. And then you've got the other extreme where you've got multi-million pound flats and with a mooring for the yacht and these sorts of things there. So and there's not much in between. So a lot of the people, one of the reasons there's this influx each day, people can't afford to live there. So they live in Spain, where it's about a quarter of the price to buy property and come over. But the schools are free in Gibraltar. So what they do is say, well, the grandkids are registered at the grandparents' place, because they could come in and go to school there. So you get an influx of school kids coming back and forth each morning as well. And another thing there, because it's so well off, Gibraltar pays government, if you attain equivalent of A levels, then you get your university fees and tuition accommodation paid for. So most of them come to further education in this country. It's just like it is here, isn't it? You will get your fees and everything paid for, don't you?
Yeah.
Yeah? No loans or anything like that. So find if you've got a Gibraltarian grandmother or something like that, and you might get it for free. So looking at a lot of the details, looking at gauging people with what are the issues, and looking at data analysis and more stakeholder involvement. Then we looked at a model, and I'll quickly run through that, looking at, again, standard, how is it working now, and different scenarios, how it might work in the future. And then coming up with a list of proposals, doing what's called a web tag. If there's a sort of a standard process of appraisal, so you look at everything that you can do and try and score those and take it through. And then coming up with a series of proposals, and we were looking at sort of basically 4 types of options. Something that was very much driven to sustainability. They have quite an issue with air quality there, partly because of the cars and partly because they've got an old power station. So that is quite an issue going forward. Looking at network demand management, like that, in parking controls primarily. And then what effectively we always come up with is some form of balance between those. And then finally coming up with an implementation plan, and this is where a lot of things fall down with the work we do. We come up with these grand ideas, we give a document over, and then nothing happens. We might do the easy bits, but we tend not to do the more difficult bits. So we're moving into that implementation stage at the moment. So the first things we always discuss, what you want for the future. Again, some of the issues on air quality and pollution, maintaining the heritage of the place, but continuing to have a healthy economy. So that is quite a challenge. I'll touch quickly on the transport model for those that are really into transport models, and we were discussing this earlier. Two choices. We could have gone for somewhere of this sort of size. We would normally say we would only go for a very simple transport model. In this day and age, maybe a spreadsheet or a GIS-based system, so you could see quite easily where people are moving around and why. And that was a very, and they're a lot cheaper and quicker to do. We actually moved in this case to a more complex model. I think we had a discussion for those with the previous lecture on VISM, so we used the VISM base for it. And the reason we did that is to try and model some of the issues that I've talked about already, the complexity of those. And we're going to make all these slides available, aren't we? So not only you don't need to take photographs, but you can. I won't run through all the details. But it's quite interesting when we were looking at the pros and cons. The simple model needed a lot less data to do it, but then it was going to be fairly simplistic on all the things that we were really interested in: boosting public transport, bringing emissions down, and looking at parking charges. So we needed that more complex model to really evaluate whether those things would work. That was the driver, not based on the size of the place alone. And so we did a lot of surveys, and this in itself caused issues, because here you go out to a survey company and get a quote for them to come in and do it. There we couldn't do that, so we trained up a lot of the government staff to do some of it, and we brought, as we were talking about yesterday, one of the companies from the UK, who then got stuck in no man's land between Spain and Gibraltar because they didn't have a permit for the cameras to go in, so that delayed everything for a couple of weeks. But we did this sort of wide range of surveys. I'll run through a couple of those without spending too much time. We did a lot of household interviews, because there was such a diverse range of people and incomes and motivators. It's an ageing population who actually live on Gibraltar, so many of them aren't working, they're retired or semi-retired, compared to those that are coming in each day. So we actually took quite a big sample size. And we looked also at, from those where people were coming from, what they're in the old town and this west side, which are fairly flat areas. We can see that the majority of modes were walking, because they're all close in. But if you move down to Europa Point, the main mode becomes car and car passenger. So even with only 6 kilometres of each other, you get quite a different pattern of how people travel and what their primary modes are and how many trips they make. And you see this is by district, you can see some of these differences. The other big thing here is, because parking is so difficult and the roads are so narrow, you get a huge number of motorcyclists and scooters that people use to travel. So they'll have maybe 1 or 2 cars. Many people have a Sunday best car. They'll take out the Merc to go around the peninsula or maybe into Spain, and then they'll park it for the rest of the week in a multi-storey garage that has cost a fortune and has probably some of the best views in the world out over the Straits of Gibraltar, and that's all it does. And then the rest of the time they'll get out their motorbike to travel around. We did a lot of roadside interviews, some at the border and some around and about. Because there are so few roads, the big danger is that we cause chaos just doing the roadside interviews, so we have to be very careful planning to do that. But again, we got quite a good amount of data from all of that, and that all fed into the model. What was interesting here was the sort of difference in travel modes and the distances travelled from those coming in from Spain and from those locally, so that many more people were and also where people parked when they did come in, so very different patterns of performance. So coming in from Spain, a lot of people were travelling by car, and high use of motorcycles and mopeds in the border districts. The other thing is to say that generally when people did drive in Gibraltar, there was single occupancy, and if they were coming in from Spain, they were generally 2 or more. Again, that's a balance. So initially you'd say, oh well, driving in from Spain's a bad thing, but they're actually carrying a lot more people than those driving in. And most were finding free spaces. And there's a continuing argument in Gibraltar about the amount of, there's not enough car parking spaces. I'll show you in a minute. They've got a huge number of parking spaces, they just don't use them efficiently. Okay. We did various journey time analysis of all over to look at that. We found that 23 kilometres an hour is not that different from many UK cities. It's quite slow. So, I won't go through all the bus patronage, but you won't be surprised to know people going to work and school and peak times and other things. So those patterns are all pretty clear. And similarly with car availability. We did a number of, I think the big thing on the parking surveys is normally you would say that if you've got on-street, you would get on-street you have a higher turnover and people would stay for a shorter period of time. Off-street in car parks, people would tend to stay for a longer period of the day. That's generally how we work things, both in how it's how charges are set. What you actually find here was people were staying on-street for longer than the off-street ones. Again, something wrong there in the way it's controlled and managed. And similarly with the use of motorcycle parking. The cruise ships was another one, talked a bit about that, wanted to come in. But a lot of people on the cruise ships, they spend their life on the cruise ship, they go from one to another. I've never been on the cruise ship, the cruise, I don't know. But they go, they're in Gibraltar one day, they're North Africa the next, Italy the next. They don't have to get off the ships. So the real, apart from filling with fuel, the real reason they want people to come in, they want to make it attractive. It's much more attractive to go to Malaga, the next port down, where it's a nice walk into the centre of the city than it is walking through the port here. So we actually looked at why people travel, and basically to the main street in the old town area, which if it's a flat walk, it's just not a very nice walk. But the taxi service works there as a sort of, the taxi drivers double up as tour guides. So they want to get a group of people coming with the cruise ships, take them to the top of the rock, charge them a fortune for it, expect to get a big tip, and then the moment they've got them up there, they want to take them back down again as quickly as possible to try and get another one. So they'll actually say that many of the attractions up there are closed, even though they're not, just to get them back down again. And it's and then we interview people at the when they come back and they feel it's a rip-off. Charged a lot of money, we've been shot around. And what we were trying to show here, and again, been outside, it's not the people who get off the ship, it's the people who have come to Gibraltar before and they never go back. They'll be on a cruise again, but they won't get off the ship. Or if they do, all they'll do is walk into the main street area and have a cup of tea and maybe fill up with some duty free. They won't go and see those sites and so because they feel they've been ripped off and they won't go and do it again. Which was an interesting bit of news that we broke to the Minister for Tourism. I should say that we had three ministers. So there's the Minister for Transport, the Minister for Tourism, and the Health Minister. So there were only 12 ministers in their government. So the reason that they had all three together, they could see the overlap of what we were doing, why it was important to do that. Also did interviews in schools. Again, you won't be surprised to know this, but there were a lot of walking, a lot of car use for the school run, which is a nightmare. When you talk to the kids, though, many of them would prefer to cycle and actually use the car. Parents won't let them, and it probably is unsafe in many areas. And then this was of interest to us in understanding what was going on both sides of the border. A lot of people travel quite a way in Spain to get to the border, so they might drive and park. They don't then drive across the border because it takes so long in the queues. So what ideally we wanted to do was look at other things that we could do to balance these up, looking at where they were going on both sides, how far they had to travel, and whether we could coordinate things. And this is the most important one, really, how many people are actually spending only 10 minutes walking on both sides, but we use a car or a bus instead. So we looked at what we could do in the future to get across that runway that they all have to walk across through the border and across the runway, which takes about 10 minutes. In the longer term, there's going to be a tunnel around the one side, but that won't deal with the foot passengers. So, although it's heresy, what ideally you want to do is at least coordinate bus services on both sides of the border, but trying to talk to the Spanish side. We did actually have meetings with the local municipality, but effectively they can't do anything. So the idea is that you might come to the border on one bus, get off, walk and get on another one is a no-no. The idea that you might actually share tickets is something would never happen. I won't go through these at the moment because I'm conscious of time.
With the Are there many people who have moved to Gibraltar or not?
We'll look at the employment things in a second, but Gibraltar is really the driver for that southern part of Spain, that probably within 20, 30 kilometres. There's Algeciras is a bay just across it. That has a port and some refinery works, but unemployment in the Spanish economy is very high, and without that Gibraltar element, that economy in La Linea and that means it would be rock bottom. So you've got this difference of views. You've got the Spanish government view that we don't want to talk to Gibraltar or Britain about this. Locally, there's a much greater, and families are not only they split, but they. So it's interesting that they actually bring the border guards there are brought in from northern Spain for a tour, because if they use local border guards who knew people, then a lot more movement would go on. But they want to bring in supposed hardliners from north of Spain who they stay there for a few months and then get moved back again, sort of thing. So it's an interesting mix, something that you don't see probably anywhere else in the world. As I mentioned earlier, bus services are free to locals, but there's still the take-up isn't that great. And they've got a number of different services, but they don't all go to the right place, and they tend to go into they've got a bus station called the Market Square. And like so many of the services in this country, we used to have services that ran from one side of the city to another, because that's what people want to do. To get the buses running on time, what we tended to do is stop them in the city centre. So you've got to go and change. You don't have that cross. When we go back, that's what we're looking at putting back in Cardiff and other places. And that's what we're suggesting here, that they need sort of more end-to-end services. Doesn't mean people go all the way across, but they want to move across the central area in particular. So we developed a series of routes that come round and an end-to-end that goes border. And some of the issues with this are that they don't then fulfil more of the social needs. So we overlaid this with more of a sort of dial-a-ride type services for people going to hospitals and other centres. And this is an example. This is the Market Square area where the buses come in and they basically get lost there for about 10 minutes. So yeah, just a quick few headlines on parking. 30,000 people, 20,000 car parking spaces, 15,000 registered cars. Basically you can do the maths. It's about, after Monaco, it's the highest car ownership in the world. And we're not actually quite sure how many cars are actually registered. And then you've got this enormous number of motorcycles and scooters as well. So it's really an odd place in that. And and there are all issues about enforcement and what people are doing and how short distances people are generally travelling by car. So what we suggest they need to do is to re-establish parking enforcement and bring in charges, etc. And I'll quickly touch on some of those. One of the particular issues was that in this country, over the last 15 years, we've had what we've called decriminalized parking. Instead of parking being a function of the police and the traffic wardens they use, we've used what are called enforcement officers, and the local authorities have become responsible for setting those fines and doing it. And instead of it being an offence where you would go to a court if you didn't pay, you go through an appeal process and things like that. Two things that. The local authorities get the money rather than going to the police coffers, but it also means that they can look much closer at what they're doing and why they're doing it. They had this system in Gibraltar, and then because of the issues with the border 2 years ago, needing many more people, the enforcement officers, the 20 or so that they had, were co-opted into the police to go and look after the queues. And within that, in no time at all, the number of parking tickets issued just dropped dramatically in months. And then people realised they weren't going to get caught, so things went from bad to worse. So So one of our key recommendations was they needed to go back and introduce that. Quickly through here, we did a lot of looking at where people walk, the numbers and the flows. There's a pedestrianised high street to the middle that gets a lot of people walking through here, but they don't then walk very far beyond that. And there are lots of barriers. So what needs to be done to help that? There were issues, people were saying they were concerned about the amount of traffic and the speed of traffic, and then obstructions of people walking across junctions and all that. So it's fairly simple stuff, but you need to look at it and see why people are travelling, where they're going to, and then whether it's worth doing the improvements. And you get loads of people still these days saying, oh, we need a bridge or we need an underpass. People don't use those if they've got a choice. They prefer to go across the road and they want the space created for them. So we came up with some what we termed core pedestrian routes and then some sort of feeders into those. And similarly with cycling, we talked about some of that, putting in parking, the Ghibli bike scheme as they had. In reality, and putting in cycle lanes, etc., and the way they might run. So come to, and then coming up with a cycle network that gave access to most of the areas. I'll just quickly touch on the model without going into too much detail. This is a basic model we came up with, looking at how the validation calibration stages, looking at average trip times, and then using it. This is looking at public transport, where people were getting on the buses and where the loads were coming from the border. There's a lot of use, but it drops off on some of these routes. So we looked at how the network existed at the moment. There was a proposal from the local bus company, and then we did some refinement to look at how we might spread the load and what the balancing should be. All of those things we wouldn't have been able to do without the more sophisticated model. And then looking at, again, the opportunity for change, how short distances people travel, and basically if we could get most of those travelling by car out of the car for less than a kilometre, that would reduce the amount of traffic by about 8%, quite big wins. So one of the other critical things that we always talk about this when we're doing this is what's the growth profile going to be in the future? In most of our UK models, it's a standard rate. We take it from growth in traffic, we take from standard DFT published figures. In the GDP, we take from economic forecasts. In Gibraltar, they don't have those sorts of things, so we had to look at what was happening. And basically, there's a general correlation if you look at how people travel, car ownership levels, and GDP. They all sort of follow a similar line. Well, what we were getting here was not that. We were getting a population that had been static since the early 80s up to now. Although there's this blip here, this is car registered. That blip seems to have been because of some fault in the system, the record keeping that they had at that time. But basically, it's also been fairly static. But the economy has been growing at 6% plus, over that period since the late 90s. So what's that doing? Why is that going up? Are all these same people being so much more productive or in higher fee earning jobs? But in reality, static population, vehicle ownership, and then when you look at it, the growth rate in jobs has gone up by nearly 5%, GDP 6%, and the number of vehicles crossing the border has gone up by 75% in 10 years. So when you actually look at the movement across the border and the GDP and the jobs index, you can see much greater correlation. But basically what's happening, because there's no more population, largely because they can't build any more houses apart from these very upmarket ones, more and more people are coming in each day. So the key thing here, I think that much of the local politicians and the press is saying, oh, the demand for parking and everything else is driven by people coming in, low quality jobs. They're coming in to sweep the streets or work in the shops or these sorts of things. But many of them are coming in to run those finance and gaming and other parts of the industry. So that's why the job increase has been so great over those years, where the population has stayed the same. So looking forward in terms of what we're going to do, would you be looking at a trend similar where by the mid-20s there'd be another 80% increase in traffic? So we went through with them about the different options that they could have here. Sort of do nothing. Well, if you do nothing, everything's going to grind to a halt, basically, and that won't look good for tourism or doing business, or the environmental standards that you want to set. You could look at a big building programme. Many people would say that's a way forward, but they don't have the land to do it, and how viable it is. But it's not just about housing, it's about the schools and the health services and all those things that go with that you would have to look at. Looking at different ways of accommodating it with designing, lots of people say, well, we need more multi-storey car parks to accommodate this, but that wouldn't be enough. So what we were getting around to was a balance, trying to get more people, to allow that economy to expand, to accept that more people were going to come across the border, and to design ways of coping with that, whether that be things like the PRT system, those pods at Heathrow, people have seen those, or cable cars going underneath the runway, or those sorts of things. So you're giving people a quality transit system to get in, but you're moving lots of numbers very quickly, but over a fairly short distance, maybe only 2 kilometres. That's the key moving forward. But accepting that the border's still going to be there in the future. So that's where we got to with the analysis. I was going to go on now to the final presentation that we gave to the Cabinet, the First Minister, as he's called. Before I do that, any questions on how we got to this stage, or any of the things that we've done so far?
Was it Visum they used? It's for the detailed study, was it?
We used Visum as our basic modelling 4-stage tool. We've used Visum to analyse some of the micro-sim of a lot of the detail. I have got some clips, but I think we're going to run out of time. But if anybody wants to see them, I can show them. But I think you've been through presentations on that. Visum, it's a useful tool, but it's mainly a useful tool to sell as project to those that don't understand it. It's a good visual tool. You have to spend an awful lot of time getting there, time and money. But if you're trying to say to people, well, we should close this road off and what the impact is going to do, if they see cars going round and people getting on and off buses, they're much more likely to believe you, even if it was little more than SimCity there, than compared to if you tell them that's what's going to be the case with data out of a strategic model. I'm not decrying that it's a useful tool for the technical people as well, but I think the real value in doing it comes from trying to bring stakeholders along with it. Anything else? Okay. I'll just quickly run through this. So this was in front of the First Minister and the Cabinet, who have got a wide range of portfolio. Just a little bit of background. The previous administration had been in power for 20 years. Didn't mean that they were a dictatorship, they just won all the elections. They have an election period of every 4 years. So when this government got in, who were more left of centre when the others more right of centre, their manifesto was, one might call it, there were a lot of promises in there, and so they were very keen to deliver. Part of doing this work was because they sort of promised to totally review the transport beforehand. So they were keen to not only come up with ideas, but also to show some change before the next general election. So this was a combination of that. In reality, we spent so much time doing stakeholder discussions, and which they're actually going to be up against the next election before they've delivered very much. The next election is later this year. So now they're going to be rewriting their manifesto and saying that we've got this plan, this is now what we're going to deliver, but they're going to be accused of spending 4 years not delivering anything, which happens everywhere in the world, but it's an interesting thing. Okay, so we reiterated the high-level policy which they wanted efficiency, environmental improvements, and more sustainability. Nobody ever disagrees with those. It's actually how you're going to deliver them. Secondary ones, more about more to do with transport, with accessibility, accidents. They've got terrible accident statistics there. The main thing that saves them is because they can't go very fast. There are a lot of injury accidents and a few fatalities, but that's luck rather than judgment. And so what we're really asking the Cabinet to do is make decisions on parking enforcement, controls, not very popular, what to do about the congestion, walking and cycling measures, public transport, and then what they're going to do about the frontier and how they can improve that, particularly if the runway, which at the moment people walk and drive across, is closed in the future. There's only 2 runways in the world that have commercial aircraft on that you can walk and drive across. One is in New Zealand and the other is in Gibraltar. It breaks all the rules, and basically what happens before a plane lands, they have to close barriers, stop people from going across, big security issues about that, but they also have to sweep everything to check that nothing has fallen that might puncture tyres or anything like that. Huge delays, and fortunately they only have about half a dozen flights a day, but if they want to increase that, and then if there's a big issue with, so when Syrian conflict and Libya conflict, the RAF use it again for putting fighter aircraft and basically close it, and it's chaos for the rest of the day. So that's a long-running issue, and they need to come to a solution. So basically what we were showing was high levels of car ownership, lots of people parking in spaces forever. Cars could be there for months at a time. The tyres are flat, they're never moved on, they don't pay anything. Blue badge scheme being very poor use of that, and ineffective enforcement in general, and very inefficient. And again, going back to the visual thing, you need to show how it could change. Instead of this chaotic and giving some sort of ability to visualise how you might control it, how you might, not only that you're moving all these away, but this particular street feeds into one of the main restaurant and shopping streets. So at the moment, if you want to go shopping there, or you want to come down in the evening, you can't find a parking space. So there's a feedback, people don't even bother coming. So this is to say, right, maximum 2-hour stay here, so you'll be able to find a space, greater certainty that you'll come and use it. So that's a selling point. But so all those bikes are moved over there. Most people here are parked for weeks at a time. So looking at taking these things out and finding other places to move things around. Parking controls moving out. Some of these are very much artist impressions because the cars will still be there, but putting in bus lanes and how. Again, we showed these in plan, but if you've got some sort of visual view on it, it just helps people to see what might be coming forward. Understanding here what might be going on and refreshing the blue badge. And this was emphasising the point I made earlier. The green here are where this parking enforcement has been taken over by the local authorities in the UK, and there are only a few standouts, and most of those are going over. It's probably out of date by now, it's 2013. It's really to say why they should decriminalise it and then have a much more efficient way of doing it. Fairly simplistic way of doing things, but it just needs a commitment to do that. Dealing with the congestion, and this again, you get locally, oh well, we've got to build some more roads. It's the age-old thing. Well, you can't just do that. That's not going to get you, not going to solve the problem. It's a greater use of public transport, encouraging walking and cycling, as well as making the best use of what you have got on the ground. Particularly, this is something I said about some of the cars parked here forever. Put tyres on, you can see that tyres are flat. this is outside the school, so ideally, and this is how people come into the school, so they park across the zebra crossings, even though there's a policeman on duty there. He decides his life isn't worth telling them to move on. So we were coming up with different ways of moving a lot of this out and trying to control this, putting in better bus stops, cycle parking, those sorts of things, visually. And because things are so sensitive, what we've suggested in all of these, that we call them pilot schemes. That allows you to vary them, it allows you to take it out if it really doesn't work, rather than say we're imposing this and through that process. And that is also a bit different to the general way things have been done there in the past. I have to say it's the way it used to be done in the UK 15, 20 years ago. We had very little consultation, stakeholder involvement. Now we're probably bogged down in doing too much of that. We consult people at every stage. Looking at some of the junctions that might be able to be improved, not to get particularly greater capacity, but just to allow more flexibility in there. And looking at some of the issues, they're common processes to put barriers up to funnel people. What if we've proved around that doesn't actually help people. People jump the barriers. What you need to do is encourage them to pass it, cross it. So what you get here was an example of some tourists. They're stuck. Then they've walked across what they think is the quickest way, and they're stuck because the barriers stop them from getting off the road. There's plenty of examples of that. And this is the point about switching car trips and under a kilometre new traffic. Putting in this network of walking routes and overcoming the barriers and cycling routes as well. And particularly important end-to-end journeys, so that you don't leave out the most difficult bits, the most dangerous junctions across. You've got to address the whole bit. And then this is the marketplace. This is the bus station that I mentioned before. So you've got the historic walls here, the fish market in here and through to the pedestrianised areas. But this is a mess, and what we're suggesting is that they could do a lot more. They could take general traffic out of here. They could still get access with rising bollard scheme. You could still cycle through here, but you move the buses outside to standard stops, and because you don't really need a bus stop where most of the time the buses sit here for 10 minutes, not moving. And then some different views on what they've got at the moment in terms of parked up vehicles and what might get in the moment. Some of these are a bit too grandiose, and you're not going to get rid of everything. And then making use of the walls. These are the historic walls, high up generally, and opening these up. Cycling might be a bit too much, but certainly walking through, they're a great route through. They've not done anything about it. They've talked about it for years and years, but not actually done anything. Public transport, key issues at the moment: infrequent, unreliable, slowed down, and the network. There's no maps of the current network, so our thing is to sort of change that around. And come up with a single network, the end-to-end services I mentioned. We're buying new buses that are because of some of the hills, they can't get electric buses to do it, but they're hybrid vehicles. And then how the operation in the future is going to look with the road across, that's the runway. This is Spain and this is Gibraltar. Sorts of things that you could do with tunnels and controls, and in the future this is sort of typical day-to-day of the traffic, people cycling, people walking across, and how that might be improved in the future with just more information systems telling people when the border is going to, when the frontier, the runway is going to close because the flight is coming, etc. So that's a basic presentation that we went through. So where are we now? Well, as a result of that cabinet meeting, we then published the document of 2 sides. One a very detailed proposal saying how we got there, and a glossy of which most people is all they would read. Consultation process was meant to close at the beginning of March. They've extended it for a few weeks, so it's closing now. I think generally people have accepted the need for change and things. I think it's when you get down to the detail of taking away people's parking spaces or other things that will be more difficult to sell. So we're pushing forward with the pilot studies. And as I mentioned earlier, the key thing they've got is an election in, I think it's the autumn coming through. So they're keen to get something on the ground now. So that's where we are. I think I've just about done my hour. So any questions on that? Anything that I've said?
There's no rail.
No. There is a cable car at the moment. The nearest railway, there aren't many railways in Spain anyway, and the nearest one is about 30 miles away. No, there's really no opportunity. The opportunity for PRT is there, and cable cars, gondolas. Interestingly, again, although Gibraltar is part of the EU, because they're such a small group, their votes are actually counted in southwest England, so Bristol effectively. So that's who their MEP is. And so someone standing for as being MEP in the last European elections we had suggested a tram system to go through, which we were then required to look at. But there just aren't enough people to do that. You need more of a system. It's as with most of these public transport, what you really need is a high degree of segregation. Segregation is the key to getting people into public transport. They can see it, they know it's going to be very reliably. Price and other things don't necessarily come into it. Journey time is an important factor, but it's not the be all and end all. So that's ideally what we're trying to do here. But also, because lots of the area is flat, and most of the year it's quite nice. It's not too hot and not too wet. Walking and cycling as a mode is an ideal situation, and people are out get away from that because one, they're fearful of cycling on some of the busy roads because they are narrow and congested, and they don't want to walk because there's no direct routes, because again congestion or it's the age-old problem. You look at some of the junctions, roundabouts there, and they put a pelican crossing that's about 50 metres that way, so you have to do a detour. The sorts of things that we've addressed in this country over the years, because we looked at those barriers to why people don't walk.
How long all the process takes?
Well, it should have taken a year to do this study, and it should have taken a year. We're effectively 2 years now, but we've spent much of the last year just discussing what's going to be said, and that's very much the politicians. And as I said earlier, I understand their concerns. They are very much local, whereas here, MPs, okay, they're aware of they've got a local electorate, but ministers tend not to be because it's well down the pecking order. So they'll look at policy, they'll make maybe some more difficult decisions and that are unpopular. Locally, it's not. They've got to find some other way of doing. So one of the key issues here would be to address the taxi issues. The taxi drivers, not only they're tourist guys, but they're meant to put so much of their time into getting a local service. It doesn't suit them, they don't get enough money out of it. So they tend to just disappear and no one penalises them. So they need to do that. The Minister for Transport or the taxi driver. It's, you can see where there's votes go, ways of agency. I don't think it's going to go back to taxi driving, but it's, it's understanding that is particularly important.
There's time for one more question, please.
I hope you're all going to go and visit Gibraltar at some point. It's an interesting place to go for a day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.